Welcome to the Let's Talk Politics Alabama podcast with your host, Daniel Stover and Russ Sanders, where we take a look at Alabama politics like a drive down I-65 from North Alabama to the state capital in Montgomery and all the way to the Sugar Sand Coast.
I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit, for political purposes, my opponent's youth and inexperience.
I'm Kay Ivey, but there's no step too high for a high stepper.
We choose truth over facts.
I don't want to speak negatively. I said, though, that if I lose this election, maybe I'll end up moving to Alabama.
Someone has once said that actually, as long as there are final exams, there will be prayer in schools.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Let's Talk Politics Alabama, the podcast. I want to take and thank everybody that's taken and liked our Facebook page. We're posting our videos up there if you want to take and watch them there as well. Not just on YouTube, and it's not just on the podcast channels. A little thing about tonight's episode 13, we ran a little long. We had a lot of things that we wanted to discuss, so we're going to break that up into two segments. So sit back and enjoy part one of episode 13. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Let's Talk Politics Alabama podcast with your host Daniel Stover and Squeaky Sanders. That WD-40 just ain't working, Russ.
It ain't working on the chair.
We are on episode number 13 tonight. Or today, whenever you're watching it or listening to us. So, we wanted to bring back our good friend and state representative Proncey Robertson because, you know, our state legislature just went into special session, and we want to find out a little bit about what's a special session, you know, what's the difference in a regular session, special session, what was accomplished type stuff, and who better than ask than get it straight from the horse's mouth here and ask Proncey about it. So, Proncey, glad to have you back with us. Let's start out with what is the difference between a special session and the regular session?
Well, Daniel, it's great to be back with you guys. I watched some of your other episodes. Y'all doing a fine job. Okay, I'm just getting good information out to the people, and hopefully we can do that again tonight. So appreciate what you're doing. You question what is a special versus a regular session. Well, as you know, the Alabama legislature, or I hope you know, is technically a part-time position, okay? What that means is that really we're in session or we're at work as far as what in Montgomery for about 14, 15 weeks each year, okay? And there's a regular session that's scheduled each calendar year that is, it's on the calendar, okay, period. And for instance, when we're elected, you know, for 4-year term, the first year will come in January after being elected in November, and then we work those weeks that I'm talking about. And actually, there's so many legislative days of each regular session, but we'd work those legislative days, and then we go sine die, or we stop the session, the regular session, and we don't work again until we come back for the regular session the following year. In the second year, it starts a little later in the year. Usually, if I'm not mistaken, the 2 middle years start in the end of or beginning of March. So they slide back a couple of months. And then the last of the 4 in the quadrennium, this one coming up, will start in January again. Now, that's directly related to the elections. Okay, so it's to get us in there as soon as possible and to organize, you know, because we have to elect Speaker of the House and leader, the caucuses, those kind of things, as soon as we get elected. So you have to reorganize because the speaker might not have been reelected, or like the upcoming quadrennium, Speaker McCutcheon's not running again. So we'll have to elect a new Speaker of the House when we come back in. That's why we come in January, and then going out, obviously, with it being an election year and the primary is in May, we wouldn't want to start later in the year so that we work all the way into June, right? So the idea is to start in January here in the 4th year so that we can do the regular session and get out. Now, a special session, what that is beyond those 4 regular sessions in each quadrennium, the governor can call us back for a special session. And it's only at the governor's call. We can't call ourselves back to work. We can't, there was a lot of people during COVID, that thought we should come back and pass certain legislation related to that, or and deal with certain issues that were going on there. But we can't do that. Only the governor can call a special session of the legislature.
And correct me if I'm wrong, there was actually some legislation that was put forth to be able to give y'all that right, and it got voted down, right?
That's correct. There was a couple of different bills that were introduced. I never got a chance to vote on those, frankly, because they never made it through a committee. The committees examined those, and in the respective spots they went to, probably state government, and decided to not forward those on to the body. So with that being said, we're still under the law that only the governor can call a special session. And when she calls a special session, it is called the governor's call. And she puts out a proclamation, or an order, if you will, from the governor that spells out exactly what she wants us to deal with in that special session. Now, the governor can call a special session at any time, including when we are in regular session. Okay. Most folks may not know that, but that's what happened even with the dealing with the gas tax. We went into, when we got there, our very first, right after I was elected, we had the state of the state, right, where the governor comes and she speaks, and then we were supposed to go into session the next day, right? Mm-hmm. Well, as soon as the governor spoke, she dropped a proclamation and put us in a special session. And what that means is that we can only deal with the bills that she puts in the call. Usually it's very limited focus. In that case, it was just those infrastructure bills that were related directly to the Rebuild Alabama and rebuilding the infrastructure in the state of Alabama. And that's what we had no choice. We have to go and we had to address each of those bills. So same way, here we are again. She has called a special session, or just did, to deal with this prison crisis. And there's a lot of reasons for why this come up, not the least of which is that have lost, hear that word, lost 15 different lawsuits filed against the state reference to our prison systems. And we are under decrees from those lawsuits that say you've got to do this, you've got to do this, you've got to do these things. Those are federal lawsuits where there's a federal judge in charge of those things. And if we just refuse and continue to ignore those orders, what do you think is going to happen? Probably the judge is going to order the federal government to come in and make those decisions for us. And you've heard Governor Ivey keep saying this is an Alabama problem and we needed an Alabama solution, right? Now it's a slogan, but it is truth too, because she's saying literally that if we don't fix this, the federal government's about to. Now, give you an example of what could have happened is that happened to California in 2011. They were over capacity in their prisons and had multiple lawsuits. They were at about 137% capacity. And Alabama's a little higher than that. We're somewhere around 140, 145% capacity. And when the feds took over California, the first order they made was, you need to release, I think it was 30,000 inmates for them. Okay? That was to bring them down to a percentage that the federal government thought they needed to be at of prisoners versus population. Now, we don't want that to happen in the state of Alabama, because 81, you probably heard this the last few days several times, 81% of our prison population are violent criminals. We're not just keeping people in there for the fun of it, okay? And so we had to deal with this. So she sent us a call that had, I think altogether there was 6 bills in total that we were to consider and address as a legislature, excuse me, during this special session. Now, any bill that starts in the legislature on any given day, if I file that bill today, it takes a minimum of 5 days to pass that bill, just because of the process that it has to go through. It needs a first reading, then it has to go to committees, then and there's time delays in between each of those things happening for public notice, media attention, those kind of things, right? So it's just constitutionally minimum. We can't just go down there today and vote on a bill. It has to go through the entire process of passing both houses. I mean by that, the House and the Senate, and then it goes to the governor for her signature. So that give you a little bit of overview. Got another question about what is a special session, or did that answer that?
I think that pretty much handled that. So, and it kind of leads into the rest of this. You know, I've read what was passed that we're not. You said, you know, like with California, they were at 30% over capacity, and you say we're even higher than that. But yet, from what I'm reading and stuff, what y'all voted on doesn't add to or expand the system to prevent overcrowding. So how is this helping?
Well, it does help because the newer facilities and the way they're designed, period, are designed to hold the prisoners the way they should properly be held. The old buildings that we have can't do that, okay? They're stacked 2 and 3 high in open bays and those kind of things. And I know Russ is familiar with how, you know, the typical jail is laid out with, even at city or a county jail, with cells, right, around the edges or around the outside, or in pods, so that you can control those, if you will, with minimal people, with cameras, and with you know, so that one guard in a tower, basically in the center, can watch 2 or 3 different pods, and if something starts happening, he can basically dispatch a guy on the ground out there to deal with that problem. Our prisons are not like that in Alabama right now. Okay. They're very much different than that. They were not designed to handle the massive number of people. For instance, we have what was supposed to have 100 people in 2-man cells, for instance, now have all those 2-man cells filled. Some of them added a bunk in them, so they may be 3-man cells. And then in the center floor between all of those cells, there's 3 high bunks. So there's like 400 in a building that should have held, you know, 150 or something. And so it's insanely dangerous for the guards, for the prisoners themselves. And with that being said, you know, we're having a huge number of assaults, physical and sexual assaults. That is just horrendous things happening. There's very few, I'll say not no, but very few cameras that are capable of monitoring these things and allowing the guards to see things. So in other words, there's a lot of blind spots that prisoners end up basically running themselves. They end up taking over a whole wing, and the guards barely even go in there. So you can imagine what a dangerous situation that is. And so we had to do some things, and these new buildings changed that whole demographic there, the whole situation tremendously. So when we talk about the safety and the concerns, the violence, the safety to our guards, the number of guards that we've been ordered to hire. So a lot of these things that we've been ordered to do in the lawsuits, these new buildings do mitigate that from a safety aspect. The other thing that multiple of these lawsuits have to do with are the lack of mental health care. the lack of educational programs. And people say, well, they don't need to be educated, throw them in a box and leave them there till their time's up. But if we don't want them to come back, there has to be some type of programs to help them with their drug abuse, to help them with some other mental issues they may have, or, just addiction and bad habits in general. And then the other side of that is teaching them some sort of skill, at the very least educating them up to a GED, and a lot of them having opportunity to get better education than that, so that when they do get out of jail, they have some chance of coming back into society as a productive citizen. And so, again, those federal lawsuits are saying that Alabama is not doing those things, that we're not providing adequate health care in the prisons, adequate mental health care for those prisoners, so they get worse and worse while they're in there. We're not providing rehab type classes and opportunities, and we're not providing them skilled type training to help them rehabilitate. So whether you agree with all that or not, the lawsuits say Alabama, you will fix these things. So how does new buildings help that? People kept saying, oh, that don't help anything to build a new, $1 billion prison. Yes, it does. Here's why. I personally was over in just a few months ago and toured the Limestone County Jail. And let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. They showed me one little, sir?
You said jail, you meant prison.
Yeah, prison. Limestone County Prison. And they had one little room that was set aside. It used to be like a day room or something in one of the bays, that had a couple of desks set up in there and a couple of computers. And if I remember right, there was only 2 or 3. And I said, what do you do with that room in there? And they said, well, that's where we teach the GED class, for instance. There's a lady that comes in and teaches that class, and it takes about 3 months and whatever the time frame was. And we can only have like 3 prisoners at a time going through that process. So why? Well, because that's the only place out of general population that we have to do that. The facility was not designed to teach that class. They've literally just picked a room off to the side to try to do it. And so the new building will have a secure, large classroom with the equipment that they need, safe for the guards to be there, safe for the prisoners to be there, safe for an instructor to be there, and teach 15 or 20, maybe even 30 at a time, so that we can actually do something to help those folks that want that class. And same thing with like skilled classes, for instance. At Limestone County, it's not set up to teach like a, think about when you were in high school, an ag class, right? Where you go and you got saws and tools and drills and things like that. Well, you can't do that in a prison, just there on the open floor and have those guys would literally be making weapons, okay? So you have to have a facility designed within the prison to be able to teach those kind of classes, to be able to accomplish those goals you're trying to do. Even the hospital itself and the infirmary, what's happening right now with our multiple prisons that are out there. And when I say multiple, I think the last count we were up over 20 different facilities. Well, each one of those has to have its own nurses, doctors, a facility to treat those folks. So what we're trying to do with these, if you will, the mega or the big prison concept is you have these prisoners in a place with one infirmary. So you got less doctors, less nurses, you got better equipment, and just bringing it to where it's, some of those lawsuits said, for instance, that we had them in inhumane conditions. In other words, they're in a building that's 80 years old, that the water is literally leaking from the floors, the water lines busting and stuff, electrical wires exposed, just things that are dangerous for me or you to be in, let alone people who have a tendency to cause trouble, right? So these things had to be improved. And so building a new building is not fixing everything by any means, guys, but it is a necessity, and it is something that is going to be a huge first step in moving us in the right direction and to keep our federal friends from taking over. And by the way, let me say this. Most of those lawsuits, and those, especially the last one and some of these biggest ones, were not filed under like the Obama administration, not all of them. The Trump DOJ, the Trump Department of Justice filed those lawsuits saying that we had these inhumane conditions. So that's a very conservative Trump administration saying you got to fix this or else. So that's the condition, and that's the situation we're in.
And let me also bring up too, you said that, you've got people that are teaching this GED class. I'm going to venture to guess here that those people these instructors and stuff are not, some prison trained person. This is somebody that's coming in from the outside to do this.
That's right. They're usually, they bid for it. They're a contractor, right? That would come in and do those jobs. They get paid by the state to accomplish that specific task. Teach a GED class, for instance. You're right. They're not there to fight prisoners, okay, or to handcuff them if they need to. That's not their job. And so we have to, if you're going to bring outside people like that in, you have to have a facility that's capable of allowing us to do that and make it safe for everyone.
Well, welcome back, everybody. We had some issues with some weather, and we've had to postpone for a day, and we're going to pick up, though, where we had left off. Proncey, you were about to tell us, I was about to ask you, when is all this supposed to start picking up as far as the renovations and all of this?
Well, because of the way we did the funding, and I'll explain that to you in a minute, it's allowing us to start on the building of the first two as early as the spring of 22. So just a few months. Just the whole bill, the way it was written, allows us to kick that into high gear, basically, and use some of the work that's already been done the last couple of years from while Governor Ivey was trying to work on this lease plan that y'all heard about. There was a huge bid process in that, and so we were able to pick up what had been done there and roll it into the new plan. And so that helped to keep us from having to basically reboot almost 2 years worth of work and start over again. Because as y'all know, those things it's a long process to get through all of that, if you will, bureaucracy of finding the right contractors, finding the right spots, all that stuff. So.
Well, and being in that world, I mean, right now it's hard to even find contractors to do anything because they're just so short-handed. Now,
along that lines, Daniel, let me say this: just prisons in general. There's not a gazillion companies out there that build prisons. You understand? I mean, there's only, I think, less than 6, 7, something like that, is my understanding, in the country that build these. And so when you talk about the bid process, it's very likely that we end up with the same circle again. So why spend another, and we literally saved thousands and thousands, maybe millions of dollars by not going through that process again. And I've got the exact number here somewhere where it says we saved there. But sorry to interrupt you there, but that's important, I think.
Yeah, but
$75 million. That's the number.
Well, that
it cost $75 million to get through that bid process where we were at.
Wow, that's a lot. I mean, I know even with our elementary school here in Moulton, they've had problems with getting contractors as far as bidding. I think I'd heard numbers of, there was like maybe, and don't quote me on this, but there was like 10 contractors that qualified, but there was only 2 that ended up actually putting a bid in, and there was only one electrical contractor that even bid it. So it's they don't have the people to do it right now. That's right. Their biggest problem.
Well, and again, what we're bidding on there when we talk about that are the general contractors. That's the big boys, if you will, the ones that's building this prison. And those are what took that $75 million in the process of what they call an RFP, or request for proposal, and all that process. It took months and months and months to get that accomplished, and all the money that's involved in that. So we stayed with those two. It started out at 6 companies, got down to 2, like you're explaining there with the schools. And so rather than start that whole process over, we stayed with those 2. Now, all the subcontractors under that will still be bid just like you would for any other process, and that hadn't even begun yet.
Yeah.
So in other words, who does the flooring, who does the exact doors, who does the lights, all that kind of stuff will still be bid out under the general.
Yeah, it'll be the GC's responsibility to
That's right.
come up with an overall price tag, and then they'll get the people working for them to do the bid.
All right, since we're talking about money here, from what I've read, we're taking $154 million out of the general fund. $400 million is coming from COVID relief, and then $785 million is coming from a bond issue.
That's right.
You know, people, you know, in layman's terms, you know, in the non-municipal world here, a bond issue is we're borrowing that money. So a couple of questions here, and I'll let you take both of them at the same time, and you can cover both of them. But number one, what kind of conditions are we putting on this bond issue? That's a lot of money that we're borrowing there. And number two, we're taking $154 million out of the general fund. What's not going to get funded this next time?
Okay. Couple things. Number one, the $154 million is every year in the budget, in each of the 2 budgets. You know, there's an education budget and a general fund budget. Education covers everything to do with education. General covers everything else in the state, you can imagine. Okay?
Right.
So people think the general fund's a slush fund. No, it pays for everything that is not education. Okay. This year, even though the COVID stuff was going on, every year there's a rollover, right? So we budget a certain amount. And the last several years, because of the conservative budgeting, we have an amount that we did not spend. In other words, the state did not spend as much as we budgeted. So there was somewhere around $350 million overage this time. So we took half of that, $154 million, and used toward this prison thing. And that was for 2 reasons. One, it's to supplement, to work in conjunction with the $400 million of the COVID money. And I'll explain why we're using that. Okay, we're not really taking away from anything else in the COVID plan. All right. But there was $400 million that we were going to use there, plus $154 million from the overage of last year. That allows us to get started on one of the 2 prisons right now. Because borrowing the money, it's just like when you go to the bank to borrow money, that's going to take a while to get through that process, right?
Right.
They don't just hand you the money the next day. And so rather than delaying this for another 14 months or whatever, waiting on all that to happen, they can go ahead and get started because of the cash on hand from the COVID money and the cash in hand from the overage, and get started on the prisons. So on the first of the 2 400-man facilities, one in Elmore County, one in Escambia County. So now let's talk about just a second that $400 million. Everybody keeps saying, "Oh, y'all wasted, you diverted money that's supposed to be for COVID."
You're taking my stimulus check. I've heard that one.
The COVID money. Yeah, the COVID money, when it came to the state of Alabama, altogether there's somewhere around, if I remember right, $4.2 billion, somewhere in that range. Okay. That was broken out though. When they send it to you, you can use $500,000 for this. You can use $500,000 for that. You can use $1 million for this. There's all these different parameters and rules that are set on the different pieces of that $4 billion plus dollars. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that they said that you could apply the money to, there's a formula that they use based on some economic things that happened during the lockdown, the revenue loss that's there. So they calculated, the federal government calculated that Alabama lost $557 million in revenue due to closed businesses and the shutdown and the other economic effects of the COVID during the pandemic. So 400 million of that, that's a reimbursement to Alabama for lost income. Okay. Other words, things that we would have spent normal budget money on that they're saying were lost.
That's tax dollars, basically.
Yeah. So it's tax dollars that we lost that they compensated Alabama for. And we could spend it on anything that we would have normally spent tax money on, just like that other 154 million that's overage. That makes sense? So it's literally going back into that pot. All right. In other words, they're saying instead of having a $50 million overage, we would have had somewhere around $800 million overage. Okay. And so they are making up that money. So we're not taking it from anybody. We're not going to have to pay that back, or the taxpayers are not going to be taxed extra for that or anything else. So the timing on this, in other words, with all the problems that we've talked about from the federal lawsuits that are there, the pandemic and the extra, or it's not extra, but money that we're being reimbursed for those problems related to the pandemic, work to have that cash on hand. So you normally, to do this, and any other time we've talked about building 2 prisons, we were going to have to borrow $1.2 to $1.3 billion to do that. So this time we were able to save, in essence, almost half of that, or not have to borrow. I heard somebody say, all you Republicans now are borrow and spend instead of tax and spend. No, we're only borrowing half as much as what we would have had under normal circumstances. So we're trying to find ways to balance this as best we can under the conditions that we're in and take advantage of that situation. Okay. So in other words, it's like you going to cars and you still got some equity in the old one. Okay. Why would you pay full price? Why not trade that car and roll that money into the price of the new one? And that's the same thing we're doing as well with the old prisons that are there, that we're shutting down, the employees that are there, and those kind of things. So part of the plan here is there'll be or the bills that we passed, is there'll be a prison, basically a commission that's put together to, that's about the revamping or the remodeling or the reappropriation of the current system and the prisons that are there. In other words, here's what's going to happen. We have right now the 400 million, the 150 million, and the 750 or 780 million that we borrowed. That money is going to go to build the first 2 new prisons and get us up and going with that. Then in the coming years, we're going to, with the overage that I'm talking about that we've been having the last few years, based on whatever that is, we will allow the commission to make decisions about what of the other prisons will be closed and or reevaluated and remodeled and upgraded and so forth. Okay. So, and then there is also in the plan that we will, in the phase 1 is building those first 2 prisons. Phase 2 is to go pay as you go, not borrowing, pay as you go with that overage we have each year, and rebuild Tutwiler, which is the female prison, down south down there, and also then begin to reevaluate where these other prisons are, which ones need to be revamped and so forth, and or shut down, and that's going to happen over several years period. So, and that's, again, will be done pay as you go. We're not borrowing any more money other than this 780 million. And so, in essence, that's good. To build all the prisons, do all the renovations we would needed to, you're looking at somewhere around $4 billion. It would have been a huge price tag. So we are not borrow and spend. We are actually save and spend what we got, Republicans. That's what we're doing down there. Okay.
Yeah, I just added it up. It's almost it's 1.3 billion with a B dollars that we're talking about here just to handle what y'all have already set forward here.
One other thing, Daniel, I need to mention that in that 154 million that we're talking about, 19 million of that is going to purchase the Perry County facility. Have y'all heard about that?
No.
Okay, down in Perry County, it used to be a private prison that was there, okay, that was owned by a private company, and they basically built it to try to lease, I guess, space to the state of Alabama. That never did really work out. It was there for several years, and it just went out of business, so to speak. So it is almost a brand new prison facility that holds 850 people, 850 prisoners. And I've seen it. I've been down there and taken a look at it. It looks like a brand new facility. They're selling it to us for $19 million. We're going to buy that, and Pardons and Parole is going to take that over as an intake center to transition folks in and out of DOC, as well as a dips and dunk center. And I know Russ knows what that is, right? That's when somebody is on parole or probation and they violate that probation, and a probation officer revokes them and sends them back to prison. There's this thing called dips and dunks. Depending on the level of trouble, I guess, they got in for their probation violation, they would go back for, say, a 45 or a 60-day stint in prison. Well, instead of having to work them into the big system, they would go to Perry County, be processed in there quickly, rather than sitting in one of our county jails and costing the individual counties multiple millions of dollars every year in housing those folks. And that facility is designed so that when those guys come in there for that dip or dunk, or they're in the transition in or out, that there's some educational programs, there's some drug programs, some things that probation and parole will be doing there to try, which that's a big word, to rehabilitate these guys and gals, and help, and then primarily men, now that I say that, to get them in and back out into society again, because they're going to get out. They're going to go back down there for 60 days. And so while he's there, why not get him in a drug class, a detox basically while he's there, and try to get that gentleman back on his feet and back into society when he comes out.
Okay. Well, as far as the bond, what's the interest rate or whatever that the state's going to be stuck with here?
Well, frankly, Dan, I don't know the exact interest rate, and it will vary a little bit based on whatever the current market price is the day they apply and all that stuff, but it is very low. That's why, you remember a couple of years ago, I think it was a session before last, we did the bond, the $1.2 billion bond for Alabama schools, for them to rebuild and to do infrastructure, capital improvements at each of their campuses across the state. And every jurisdiction, every school district got a piece of that based upon their school population. Well, that bond was so low that we actually got such a great deal on that they had an extra, I think it was $400 million that came back to the state when it initiated the first bond. In other words, when we applied the amount the payment was, they had to overpay us what we were going to borrow because we were already, starting the process, right? Well, we anticipate the same thing could happen with this bond, where we would actually have to spend less of that 154 million than we're anticipating. So it's the best time possible if we were going to borrow money. Let's just say that.
Okay. Russ, I think you had...
answer that question?
Yeah. Russ, I think you had some questions there.
Several questions. First of all, I think we would be doing this podcast and the viewers a big disservice. We need to recognize Sergeant Risner, who was shot and killed in Muscle Shoals. Sheffield police officer killed in Muscle Shoals, as well as Lieutenant Dotson that was shot over there as well. This is fresh on everybody's mind, especially y'all talking about prison or sentencing reform, prisons, et cetera, et cetera. And I know there's a lot of hype out there about that guy being out after doing manslaughter, things like that. I want to touch on that in a minute. I do have some questions before we get into that. The first question is can we cannot increase the number of bed space? Is that correct?
Well, that's what I've been told and understand. And let me tell you why. Again, we're under those multiple court decrees I was telling you, right? I mean, lawsuits that have been filed that we lost, all right? And the judge in those cases has ruled and it has made the statement multiple times, I'm not allowing y'all to build your way out of this, okay? Now, that doesn't mean that we couldn't negotiate something out with him on that, right? But as things have progressed so far, that's what you just said is correct, okay? In other words, you have beds for 10,000 prisoners. You have 15 or 16,000 in jail. The judge said you can't build 6,000 more beds, all right? He don't want us to do that. In other words, that's too easy for you. I want you to figure out how to reduce the population and make these places safer for the individuals that are there. Now, you can agree or disagree with that philosophy, but when the judge gives that kind of order, you have to figure out a way to deal with it.
And I'm obviously not blaming you at all for friends. I know you're in law enforcement. You like putting bad guys in jail. The issue is I've been to community meetings lately, and people are, for lack of a better term, just pissed off because they see people going to jail over and over again, getting found guilty, back on the street, breaking into their car again. Cops are getting frustrated because by the time they get done doing the paperwork, the guy's beating them out of jail. You make another case on them again, their bond gets revoked, then they plead guilty to the first one, and then they get credit for this. It's just a very complicated process that the layperson, unless they're really really into the court system, really they don't understand it. It doesn't make sense, and it doesn't pass the common sense check. If we need 16,000 people in jail or in prison, we need to have 16,000 people in prison. And I think, real quick, I think that we need to explain the difference between a prison and a jail. A jail is a county, is usually ran by a county or municipality, primarily a county. And those are people that are awaiting trial. They've not been found guilty. So they're in jail awaiting trial, or they're serving out a sentence for a misdemeanor. But recently, there has been a change in the law with a Class D felony. So a lot of those people, you might have 16,000 people doing state time, but in actuality, that number's higher because a lot of those people are being held in a county jail. So some of your Class D felony people are being held in county jails, and that's also putting a very big burden on your county jails.
And you know this, that the Class D felonies, technically a Class D felony, you can't get jail time. The judge can't even give you jail time for that, okay? What's staying in the county jails are those Class C, B, and A's that are waiting their turn to go to the state prison. And with 140% capacity, DOC only brings somebody in when they have room for them at this point. Okay, they're not trying to take that up to 150. And it's like you said, as many that are in our county jails, if we just sent all them to DOC today, we might be back up around that 150, 160%. And
I guess
that would be a mess.
I guess what I was getting at is like, say I arrest you, or I arrest somebody possession of controlled substance. Then they get out, they get arrested again for possession of controlled substance. Both those Class D felonies, so they sit in jail. Circuit courts, all these courts are backed up, across the country. They sit in jail, then they're like, oh, okay, you served all your time, you're not going to DOC. So basically, their bond got revoked, and then they get credit for that time. I guess that's what I meant. I didn't really mean that. I wasn't trying to blame the state for that, but I know that there's a lot of people sitting in county jails that are supposed to be in prisons.
And as you know, frankly, the state's not doing they're supposed to reimburse the counties for that time, so much a day for holding that state prisoner, right, after he's sentenced by the county or the state court. But that's a slow process, as you know. So, yes, it's
Lawrence County Jail is supposed to have like 110. It's at 150, sometimes 180, 190. So they're at the 150, right. 80, 90. It's not like, Morgan County had 800. I think they got 800 beds, and they was under a federal decree. With all this stuff going on, it's frustrating. Again, I'm not. In no way is this your fault at all. I'm not implying that at all.
It's all my fault. That's what everybody tells me. But
so I guess
it is in this sense. It is in this sense.
Sue to get more bed space to the federal government. Is that can something like that? I don't know. I'm just
they could. Yeah, you could, and he's constantly working on that. Obviously, there is a massive amount of pressure from the federal DOJ, and this is not just the Biden administration. Back when the Trump administration was there, to reduce the prison populations. I'm just being blunt with you. They're demanding that the states find ways to reduce those. So I understand, and I am with you in the sense that if a guy gets 10 years, he ought to do 10 years. The reality is that the lawsuits that are costing the taxpayers billions of dollars, okay, to keep these folks in there, and it would cost billions more than we're already paying to try to do what you're saying. Well, let's just build more prisons. Well, you see how expensive that is. And at the same time, the lawsuits are going on saying we're not doing it fast enough. And so we're paying out huge settlements and things like that. So it's a mess, frankly. And so when you say it's all my fault, it is to some extent Alabama's fault. This is something that didn't start in my, I've been down there 3.5 years, right? Well, it started 30 years ago, and it's a problem that's been going on for decades now. That's gotten worse and worse and worse, and we've continued for years to kick that can. Every governor, every legislator, every piece of the public out here has said, don't do that today. Don't spend money on prisons. Don't do this. Keep them in there longer. We want to, well, now that's kind of catching up with us. It's all kind of coming to the bottleneck of the funnel, and we've got to make some really hard decisions. And, frankly, I don't like the decisions we're having to make all the time there. But we've got to figure out ways to balance this and figure out how to. The best way to do that is try to do a better job of keeping people from coming back. Because you know this too, Russ. The majority of these folks that go in on, lesser crimes come back again, all right, on a more serious crime. And so we've got to stop that circle, that revolving door of recidivism. And so a lot of the programs and the things that are being ordered from the federal courts and a lot of the design of these new buildings, as I talked about earlier, is to try to start changing that pattern. And like it or not, that's what we've got to do rather than just continue to build more beds. That's not working. We've done that for 30 years. The more beds we build, the more prisoners you and I as cops will send down there. And so we've got to find a way to balance that.
Nobody's, and I hear this all the time, nobody is sitting in prison for having a couple of joints. That is BS. And then people talk about, well, they ought to throw away the keys. Somebody that touches a child, a sex crime. People don't even understand how hard those crimes are to get a conviction in court. You got to bring the victim up there. They don't want to relive it, and then finally you can go through all that, and then a good defense attorney pass a little bit of doubt. There's some doubt in there, and they wind up finding them guilty on something maybe a little less, which may not require prison sentence. So you've got people that commit sex offenses, been found guilty of sex offenses, they ain't even going to prison.
Let me ask you a question.
It just blows. I know it ain't your fault. I'm just saying, that misconception that people are sitting in there for marijuana is crazy.
Well, I take it very seriously, Russ, just like you do, and just like my fellow citizens here do. Is we've got to figure out people who are violent criminals need to be locked up. They need to stay there. They need to serve their time. 100% with you. Okay. We're at the point now that 81% of those in our prisons are those violent folks. Okay. At the same time, you've got a huge demographic of our population out there demanding that we're, saying just what you are. Oh, people are down there for nothing. You ought to be letting them out earlier. So we've got to find, we've got to try to find the balance to that. Okay. And it's a difficult task.
Well, let me ask a quick question here. I mean, I'm not a police officer. I don't deal with, the class of felonies. Can y'all give an example? I know you said Proncey, A, B, C, and D. Can y'all give some examples of those? I know Russ has already said, like a class D would be, possession of.
I catch you with less than 8 grams of methamphetamine, a little bit of cocaine, something like that, or a bunch of pills, a bunch of Xanax. That's class D felony. Class C would be like
maybe. So let me tell you, this is the gist. Okay, when you think of violent crime, those rape, robbery, murder, those major sex offenders, they've abused children, things like that. Those are class A. That's the worst of the worst. Okay. And those are the ones that even the good time rules and things like that and all that do not apply to. That's those bad boys. Okay.
20 years and plus.
Stay in prison. Yeah, 20 plus years in prison. Okay.
Above that, you have capital offense.
But so many times when someone is charged with a class A assault, for instance, a first degree assault for shooting someone who had serious physical injury or attempted murder kind of level charge. Okay. That's a class A. But when they get to court, their attorneys most likely is going to plead that down to an assault second, which is a class B. All right. Class Bs are lots of things like drug possession, and I mean serious drug possession now, like cocaine, methamphetamine, those type things. A lot of the distribution charges for sale of those items are class Bs. So those are big crimes, but they are not violent crimes. Okay. So those people are eligible for things like good time. Even something like this guy who shot and killed all these folks over in the Florence, including a police officer in the Shoals there. He killed his father, but he pled guilty to a class B felony, which was manslaughter. Okay. You could be charged with manslaughter for being in a wreck that killed someone.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's the kind of crime that he got. But normally he would get maybe 6 or 7 years for that under a class B manslaughter. They enhanced that to 10 years because there was a weapon involved. That was the plea. But because it's a class B, not an A, he still was eligible for the good time that is under the good time law. Now, I don't like the good time law at all, okay, because it gives you basically for every 30 days you serve in state prison, if you don't get in any trouble, you get 75 days off of your sentence. Okay.
Wow.
So you can start doing the math. He was sentenced to 10 years. The first month, he started knocking time off. Okay. Now, yes, he got in trouble a couple of months. But when he got those in trouble, he was 75 days went back on. But 75 days ain't much in that grand total, all right, that he's accumulating over those years. And so, yes, he ended up getting out at about 3 years. I don't like that. I think we need to look at that and adjust that. Okay, let me be clear about that. Okay, and I think you're going to see that talked about in the upcoming sessions. With that being said, so you got those class Bs. Now think about those class Cs down below them. They're getting even less time, and they're getting out on good time as well. So they're sentenced to like 5 years or 3 years. They're getting good time as well. So you're seeing those guys back in a year, 18 months. Okay. The Class Ds that were mentioned, that's the lowest degree down here. Those are really low-level thefts, some minor possession, like possession of marijuana, those kind of things. And those guys, you can't even send somebody to state prison on a Class D. They are serving those either in the county jail or no time at all. Okay. They're going, a lot of times they're going into these, like you've heard of the community corrections programs.
Right.
And I know you talked to the judge about that a little bit the other night. Those are the kind of people, those Class Ds, those Class Cs, that he would be looking at putting in one of those type rehabilitation type programs or local supervision programs. So if you will, they're like probation, right?
Right.
So that they can be monitored. They have to do drug tests. They're required to work, those kind of things to try to keep those people from doing what? Going to prison and taking up a bed that a Class A or a Class B fella should be in.
Right.
Okay. So they're constantly coming to the legislature. When I say they, different groups that are out there, activists, the courts, one thing or another, and trying to get us to impose new laws that allow people other opportunities even to get out even earlier. One of those such bills, or one of the ones that we dealt with during this special session. And back in 2015, there was something called, most people refer to it as mandatory release. What it should probably be called more truthfully is mandatory supervision. Okay. And let me try to explain this is that let's say one of those guys that's a Class B felony or a Class C felony, and he's getting good time and all that or whatever, but he's got a date that he's scheduled to what's called EOS, or end of service, end of sentence. And so let's say it's 5 years. When he hits that date, DOC will release him. Okay. And they're working toward that date from the time they get in, whether it's with good time or any other things that are there to help them reduce it. It is what it is because of the law, but they're working toward that EOS date. Now, if someone stays a year or 5 years or whatever, when they hit that EOS, they walk out of the prison and they are free as the three of us are. Okay. They don't report to anybody. They don't wear any ankle bracelets. They don't have to get a job. They can go right back to burglarizing houses or right back to the crack house. Okay. And if Russ as a police officer or me as a police officer were to run into them the day after they're released, we would have to start the process that Russ has been talking about all over again because they are EOS. They are end of sentence. They have served their time. Okay. So what this bill that we just passed did is it said this. Here's what we will do. If you have an EOS date of whenever it is, based on the crime that you're in there for, the level of crime you're at, if you've been sentenced to a sentence 5 years or less, then 5 months before your EOS date, we will release you, okay, under these conditions. You go under the supervision of a local probation and parole officer. And he will do an evaluation on you and determine whether you need to wear an ankle bracelet, whether you need to drug test, whether you need a job, and how often you report to him for those next 5 months. So the idea is that we don't just turn him loose, is that for 5 months after he gets out, if he's got a sentence less than 5 years, then he will be monitored for at least 3 to 5 months when he comes out of prison. And if he does well, he doesn't violate anything, then he can stay out. All right.
Okay.
If he was on a sentence of 5 to 10 years, then he's eligible to get out 6 to 9 months early. If he is on a sentence of 10 years or more, okay, and he's got an EOS date, okay, then he can get out up to 12 months early, 1 year early, with the condition again that he will be under the control of a probation officer during that time. So it's not mandatory release. We're not just letting them go early. We're saying that anybody who comes out has to be under the supervision of probation and parole. So the idea was that we are monitoring these people better, not just allowing them to be free as a bird as soon as they claim their new EOS date. So some people, I know that's hard to understand and that's too complicated to explain to just on the news tonight, right?
Yeah, that's a lot to absorb, period.
Yeah, it is. And that's what, and it's very complicated. Now, on top of all that, every sentence, depending on how long you've been into jail, you have the opportunity to go before the parole board, right? So everyone, unless they're sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, and there's not many Class A guys in there with that distinction. If you're one of those Bs, even an A, but a B and so on forth down, you will get an opportunity every so many years to come before the parole board, and they will discuss your case and decide whether you get released and when your EOS date will be. All right. And so even if they set an EOS date, what we're saying is they cannot be just released without being on some kind of supervised probation. That makes sense?
Yeah. Russ is over here itching to ask a question. So,
all right, that's you.
I need to answer your question first, Daniel. So for a Class D felony, punishment is a year and a day, no more than 5 years. Okay. For Class C felony, it's a year and a day to no more than 10 years. For a Class B felony, it's no less than 10 years, no more than 20 years. For a Class A felony, it's no less than 10 years or no greater than life or 99 years. A capital offense is life without or death penalty.
That's way up there.
Wait, I mean, that's
we have plenty of those.
So going back to that, Proncey, I do have one question. I do have a series of other questions. We went down this other rabbit hole. So if a parole officer says, hey, this guy doesn't need to be released on parole, right? He needs to stay in prison and make it all the way, and we need to leave it in here to the EOS date. What's the difference between that and granting him parole essentially 5 months early? If the parole officer, because they're trying to dump them out anyways. So maybe not in spirit, but they understand because they fall under the Department of Corrections, the parole board does, and the probation parole officer fall under the Department of Corrections. So they understand they have the same chain of command, the same guy at the top. So they understand the difficulties as well as, managing these people when they're out. If they've decided that someone shouldn't be put on parole and should stay in prison for the amount of time possible, why would we want to let them out 5 months earlier, 12 months earlier, if it's really not a very good chance of them succeeding anyways? What's the difference between that and parole?
Again, the argument is, if that guy is that bad and you keep him another 6 months, is it better to keep him locked up another 6 months, or is it better to try to, okay, let's see how you do out here, and I'm going to keep a short leash on you, including an ankle monitor, including coming to see that probation officer as often as you want him to, including having to get a job, including deciding and controlling where he lives, who he associates with, all those kind of things for at least a period of time. Or you can say he's so bad, we're going to keep him here right to his EOS, but the next day he's free.
They should add that.
And that's the argument. Well, we can't add to a sentence. And you know that. The judge sentenced him. We can, reduce it through things, and I say we, through legislation and so forth. But you can't pass a law that says the guy serves 20 years plus another year. That's just, the court makes those decisions. The judge sets those parameters.
I just feel like, and I understand completely where you're coming from. This guy's going to get out.
Let me say this clearly. Is I'm not necessarily saying that that's the best way to do it, okay? I'm not telling you that I'm for everybody getting out a few months early, okay? But I'm telling you that the argument was made that if we are really trying to rehabilitate these folks, if that's really the goal, is to not have them come back, then are we going to do it so that we can have some control of how they go back into our neighborhoods? Or are we going to just hold them an extra day and then let them go completely free to start all over. Because you understand, when a guy's in that 6 months even, Russ, and he's on probation and parole, if he has a PO officer and you as a police officer stop him because he's violated another crime, then you can call up his PO and he can lock him up right then. He does not, there won't be a bond or anything else until he goes and sees the judge, right?
And then they'll dump him for 30 days.
That's right. Okay. So at least we got some control, and that's the argument. I'm kind of being devil's advocate here to say that that's the argument. That was the argument to the legislature to say we got too many people in here. They're coming back too much. We don't want them to get out and come and violate, get arrested, and come right back. We want them to have an opportunity to get back into life. And to do that, we need to figure out better ways to bring them back into life. And so that was what the argument is. I'm not telling you it's perfect. I'm not telling you there won't be some folks who, the second they're out, you know as well as I do, they got choices to make.
And I would go through a door any day with you, utmost respect, and worked with you in the past. I'm not in any way going, I know that you've got.
I know it.
I know that you got people's back, and I don't want the viewers don't even understand how close we are. I highly respect you, but I think people are confused because there's so many programs out there. You got probation, you got parole, you got community corrections, you got drug court, you got dips, you got dunks, you got pretrial diversion program, you got community corrections, you got post-trial diversion programs, work release programs, halfway houses, in custody rehab, mental health treatment. I mean, there's 50,000 things, and I think we just need to call it probation, parole, or pre-sentence something or another. People are. Yep. I just think that we're just creating things that are doing the same thing as other programs are doing.
And now you're going to add on top of that intake center.
Well, I understand the intake center because, they have to.
That's trying to save the county some money.
Yeah, you arrest somebody. And then you take them like an intake center, like everybody goes to Kilby now. So if you're going to go to Department of Corrections, every sheriff's office has a little old deputy that goes, picks up the guy from the county jail, works overtime, drives all the way to Kilby and drops them off. And Kilby, they come in there and they process them, decide what they want to do with them, which facility they want to get them to so they're closer to their family.
Where there's a bed open, that's right.
Where they meet the facility, their level of care. Or they might be a blood or a crib or something. They need to separate them from this person or that person. So they do a big intelligence thing and then send that person to where they need to go. I understand that.
Yeah.
It's just all these programs. It's hard it's a hard pill to swallow. It took me forever to kind of get some granularity of understanding, and I don't even have the full.
It's very complex situation. There's no doubt about it. And, people, y'all hear me say that all the time. Whatever issue we're talking about, oh man, that's complicated. Well, it is. And there's anybody out there that makes fun of that, says, oh, it ain't complicated, just lock them up forever. You haven't dealt with Judge Thompson.
Do y'all plan on getting another intake center up here in North Alabama so these North Alabama counties and sheriffs don't have to drive all the way down to Kilby to drop a prisoner off to kind of save those northern rural counties?
There is some discussion about that. And just as we're talking about Perry County, is that, it'll meet that need very well for now. But as they really reevaluate these other facilities in phase 2, it is very likely that you'll see one of the older facilities be revamped up North Alabama somewhere to do that, so that our sheriffs up here don't have as far with that transportation you're talking about. So it's an ongoing process. This is step even one of, 1,000. This is not something that you're going to fix overnight, y'all. People go, well, y'all should fix this tomorrow. As you can see, just from our conversation here, it's a little more complicated than that. You can make fun of me for saying that if you want to, but I encourage anybody that wants to solve the prison problem to, come get involved.
Well, heck, I need a flow chart just for y'all for what all we've just talked about. I mean, I just sitting here kind of trying to absorb it, and I can't follow you. I mean, just like Russ said, with all these different programs, they're all called something different, but they're kind of doing the same thing.
Yeah.
And I'm not in the court system. You know, I'm very much outside looking in, and it's just mind-boggling just what you went through.
Yep. Well, and imagine, Daniel, a lot of the legislators who come down there, I'm fortunate to be, I was assigned to the Joint Prison Oversight Committee. And when I come into that room, you know, I'm there with other, some attorneys and other businessmen and things like that, that have no more background in that necessarily than you do. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so, I'm fortunate enough to have a little bit of on the ground experience to some of these things. And I try to help them apply that knowledge to say, like Russ is doing here. No, that doesn't happen. Let me tell you what's really going on.
Right.
And because they may see the written law, or they may have some comprehension they have of it, but sometimes reality and the sheer numbers of all these things are very, very complex.
Wow.
Would any of the, Proncey, I know I briefly touched this, would anything that y'all passed last week, would it have affected the time that the offender who murdered police officers, I'll be truthful about that, the guy that murdered police officers, would it have affected his sentence at all? Would he have stayed in jail any longer, or prison any longer, no, based off y'all's legislation?
What we passed last week, in essence, here's how it would have affected him. He would have gotten that. I say he was sentenced to 10 years. So about 6 months earlier than what he did get out. So probably, you know, he got out, they say, I think what I've heard is 3 years, 2 months, and some days. Okay. Is what he served. So somewhere around that 2 years, 7 months, something like that, he would have been released under the supervision of a parole or probation officer. Okay. And that parole and probation officer would have required him to have drug tests. He would have required him to get a job. He would have required him to report to him once a month for the remainder of his last 6 months there. What happened to him is different is when he hit his good time release date, his EOS date, he got out and he started all over. And that guy he got out in 2016. So since 2016 until this that happened the other day, to my understanding, he's not been in any other serious arrest or crimes. So would it have affected him getting out a few months, 6 months earlier under probation or parole? Probably not. And, had he served his whole 10-year sentence, I can't, frankly, I don't know of anyone on a manslaughter charge with a 10-year sentence that wouldn't have already been out too. And I'm not trying to be short with that. I'm saying just because of the system and the way it works right now, I was shocked if he was still in prison, even if he had, got in trouble every month and lost his good time. Mm-hmm. So it's a terrible thing. And I want to say this, and I'll shut up about this. Everybody has decisions to make. There's good guys and there's bad guys out there. And whether that guy got out in 2016 and never committed another crime, or whether he got out and he killed 3 people the next day, the person we should blame is that criminal and the decisions that he made. These programs are to try to help them to not reoffend and repeat and get into these messes. But they still have to make some hard decisions for themselves. And as we know, individuals fail us every day, right? People mess up and criminals do criminal things. So while we're trying to say, let's lock them all up for every day that they should, even if that guy served every day of every minute of that 10-year sentence, when he got out the next day, it's still up to him whether he goes and shoots a police officer and fights and runs and kills his roommate and all those kind of things. So we still have a bad guy to blame here, and that's who we need to focus on for sure. Meanwhile, yes, there are lots of problems that we need to work on with this system, and things that we can improve, and I'm committed to try to continue to help do that, okay, to be a part of that process.
All right. Thanks for joining us for part 1 of episode 13. We're going to pick up next week with episode 13, part 2, or maybe just call it episode 14. But we appreciate you tuning in. Again, if you're following us on Facebook, great. Take and share. We really want to take and grow our program, and we're trying to reach statewide, not just locally. So make sure that you take and share the podcast, the videos. If you're listening to us on the podcast, make sure you're giving us a 5-star rating and hit that subscribe button. Going back to Facebook, hey, give us a thumbs up. Leave us a comment. Hey, we'd love to hear from you. And if you're watching us on YouTube, go ahead and hit that like button and hit the subscribe button. We're really trying to grow our channel, and we really need your help to do it. So, until next week, y'all be good.